So I'm usually in the song leading rotation, and I usually don't read the scripture, but I think it's more than coincidence that I have to read this scripture because my day job is helping people store up treasures on earth. Also, I think it's more than coincidence that Greg mentioned in his prayer, with the events of this weekend, we're reminded that there is tremendous darkness and there is tremendous light in this world. So our prayers collectively go out, as Greg mentioned, to those in the world, especially Paris, but all over the world that are shocked by the events of this weekend. From Matthew 6, verses 19 through 24, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the whole body. If your eyes are healthy, then your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, then your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money."
Good morning. Andrew, I'll cut you a little slack today. I'm actually not preaching too much on money, so should be all right. So as you all are aware, it's been mentioned already, Paul Fisher's out today. So for our visitors, I typically, whenever I preach, I like to always just kind of qualify my comments that since I am just filling in, if I say anything that just seems off base or weird or offensive or anything, just let that be a reflection on me and not the congregation or leadership as a whole. I don't think that there's really anything that I would say today that would qualify in that, but just to be on the safe side, throwing that out there. Typically when I preach, typically the Friday and the Saturday before are very stressful days for me. I usually think about the sermon well in advance of when I'm actually going to be doing it, but for whatever reason, usually comes down to working on it on Friday and Saturday. And originally, my plan was, the title of my sermon was going to be Masters of the Universe, and I was going to have lots of He-Man references. And it turned out that was a bad idea, so I didn't do that. But so last night, I was done kind of with the content, and I was putting together my PowerPoint slides, and I thought, maybe I could see if there's a way to work in some He-Man stuff. And so I actually got out my DVD of Masters of the Universe, and I watched it last night, all the way through. And that was also a bad idea. I'm sitting there and I'm working on my PowerPoint slides, and every now and then I'd look up and I would have this moment. There's like this two-phase process you go through when you watch this movie. And the first phase is, while you're watching it, you're going, I can't believe I'm watching this movie. What am I doing with my life? But then the second and really more devastating phase is what immediately follows after you watch the movie. You then sit and reflect and you go, I can't believe I watched that entire movie. And I usually don't sleep well the night before I preach. I usually have a lot of nervousness and anxiety. And last night I couldn't sleep because I was so disappointed in myself for having actually committed to watching that entire movie. And so it was quite a journey for me. So for those that are visiting, as we've kind of touched on, we've been working our way through the Sermon on the Mount. And when Paul approached me a couple weeks ago and asked if I'd be willing to fill in, I said, sure, no problem. What do you want me to preach on? And he told me the verse. And when I first heard that, I was a little bit stumped about it. When I looked at it, I wasn't really sure kind of what my angle was going to be, into the passage. Between a mortgage and student loans, storing up treasures and money is not really an issue for me. So I didn't really know what I could bring to this. I happen to find the following sentiment pretty appealing. If you can read that. That's kind of where I tend to fall with this issue. And so I wasn't really sure what I was going to say about it. I wasn't sure what wisdom or insight I could provide that would have meaning for us as a congregation, especially within the context of the Sermon on the Mount as a whole. And the other challenge is when you read it, does anyone really disagree with what's being said? I mean, I heard Warren saying some amens. I saw you nodding and going, oh, yeah, that's right, So, and Andrew was clearly convicted by just having to read it, So you sit there and you go, I don't know what I can really bring to this. But I was reminded of a project manager that I used to work with. And he would always say that whenever you're stuck on a project or something that you're working on and you're not sure kind of how to move forward, he said, always lean back on your methodology. And what he meant by that was, get back to the basics, kind of get back to the core of what you're trying to do. And so I took that advice to heart and I said, don't really just look at the passage itself. Too often we do that. We go, okay, this week we're on this section, and that's just going to be kind of where I focus my attention. But it's really important at times to look at the passage in relation to the broader context of the dialogue of the Sermon on the Mount, and really within the broader context of Jesus' ministry. And when you do that, what I really found is that the Sermon on the Mount serves as a creation narrative that is parallel to the creation narrative in Genesis. As we see in the Sermon on the Mount, there's a new era of creation that's beginning. But this time it's not being spoken into existence, but rather it's being ushered in by the promised Messiah. There's this new opportunity that's being presented for people to once again be in relationship with the Father. And just as it was in the garden, the people must be presented with a choice as to which master they will serve. And that's kind of the context. That's really kind of the thesis of what I'm going to talk about today that our verse happens to fall within. So I want to take a little bit of a step back, though, and look at Matthew and kind of the Sermon on the Mount as, from a holistic standpoint first, before we kind of narrow it down into our particular passage that we looked at today. Matthew does some interesting things. He makes some interesting narrative choices in how he writes and lays out his book. And one of the interesting things is that Matthew doesn't document Christ speaking until about the 3rd chapter. And I believe that is a very intentional editorial omission. Before Jesus speaks, Matthew needs to first establish Jesus' identity and authority. And in doing so, he establishes the credibility of Jesus' message. I don't know if you guys can read that. It's pretty small. But so there are 3 things basically that Matthew does in the course of his book. And the first thing that he does is he documents the genealogy of Jesus. And in doing so, he connects him as part of the genealogy of Abraham and also connects him to the fulfillment of the prophecies that we see in Isaiah, Hosea, Jeremiah, and Micah. Now, the second thing that he does is he confirms the deity of Christ by documenting his baptism and the confirmation that comes from God that Jesus is indeed his son. And the third thing that he does is he tells the story of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. What that winds up showing is that Satan is not going to have the power to influence Jesus as a man like he did with Adam and Eve when he was in the garden. And so because of this, because he has documented the genealogy and connected him to the line of Abraham, because he confirms the deity of Christ that we get from the confirmation from God, and because he's able to resist temptation in the wilderness, Jesus' identity and authority are now established as far as Matthew is concerned. And from that standpoint, Jesus' ministry can now begin. Now when we get to the Sermon on the Mount, it's a very significant moment because this is the first major discourse that we see from Jesus, though it's not meant to imply that this is the first sermon that Jesus gives. Matthew clearly states prior to the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus had been going around ministering throughout Galilee while also teaching and performing miracles. So we're not simply saying that the Sermon on the Mount, that's the first time he ever speaks and it's this big thing. It's likely that Jesus had spoken variations of the Sermon on the Mount at different times and places when he was going around Galilee. But what's different about the Sermon on the Mount is there seems to be a significance in terms of the crowd. By the time we get to the Sermon on the Mount, what Matthew says is that the crowds had become significant. All the times that he'd been going out and preaching around, that message was getting out. People were becoming attracted to this message that they were hearing, and people began following him in great numbers. And so by the time we get to the Sermon on the Mount, we're at kind of a critical mass. There's this massive group, and it was partly what required Jesus to have to go up high, so that way he could address everybody that had come to him. And I also believe, in reading it, that Matthew is making a thematic decision in his account of the events to make a larger point to the readers about the significance of Jesus' message, namely that it's a new creation that is coming into being. And he does this by mimicking the structure of the creation narrative in Genesis. And we're going to take a look back at Genesis real quick. If you want to look in your Bibles, you can. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. Never be opposed to that. But broadly speaking, there are four aspects to the creation story that we see in Genesis. Now, the first one is that the Lord's presence is established prior to the creative act. Okay? The Lord's presence is established prior to the creative act. Before we see any there shall be light and, let there be light, all that good stuff, we first are told that God existed. It says, in the beginning, God. So we know that he was there, and by virtue of his existence, before anything else comes into being, this establishes God's singular power and authority over heaven, over earth, over time, and over space. And no one other than God can satisfy that imperative, because if they could, God would not be God. So it's a very critical piece to have there, is that God has to be present prior to creation, or else he's not then God. The second aspect of creation is that the Lord first speaks to establish and separate what is good. And this designation of goodness implies a harmony and a unity with God's perfect being. When God says that he saw and it was good, that is an acknowledgement that it is designed exactly as intended. It is functioning exactly how it ought to be. It is perfect. It is in unity and harmony with God. It is a blessing that bestows confirmation, that things are as they ought to be. Now, the third aspect, the Lord provides instruction for how his creation ought to live. It's not enough for something to just simply exist in God's eyes. It must also have a purpose and a standard by which to live by. And so what we see is that in the garden, he tells Adam and Eve, your job is to tend to the garden, be fruitful and multiply, have dominion over the creation. He gives them stuff to do. This is your job. These are your responsibilities. And he also tells them about the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which will tie into the fourth and final aspect, and which is the Lord provides his people with a choice. It's not enough to just create. It's not enough to just have his followers and let them have that relationship. What's critical to the creation process is that there has to be a choice for the people to have a relationship with the Creator. Though he is the Creator, a relationship can only occur if the alternatives are made known and the choice between them is freely made. And so in the garden, we see he tells them, he says, hey, you can have the tree of life, but absolutely don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because if you do, you will die. The alternatives have been provided. They know the consequences of what happens if they do one or the other, but the choice is still theirs to make. And that choice to serve the master, I believe, is the culminating act of God's creative endeavor. And so when we look at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew shows that Jesus executed on all four aspects of the new creation, just as his Father had done in Genesis. And so what I did is I actually put together a comparison between the creation stories, just to kind of show exactly how those aspects were met in each particular case. And I'm not going to go through them in great depth here, but as you can see, the Lord established, the Lord needing to be established prior to the creative act, that first aspect. We already talked about what happened in Genesis, but we see that was addressed in Matthew chapters 1 through 4. The Lord speaks to separate and establish what is good. In Genesis 1, 3 through 27, it was God's act of speaking into creation and establishing what was good that way. But in Matthew, it's the Beatitudes that we see. Jesus defines the character and the characteristics of those who are considered blessed, or, as we might also put it, good in God's kingdom. There's a clear designation, a separation, that people who are this way, people who do these things and behave in such manner, are considered good. They are blessed, for they are good. The third aspect, the Lord provides instruction for how His creation ought to live. We talked about in Genesis, it's be fruitful and multiply, replenish and subdue the earth, rule over every living thing. In Matthew, it's been everything that we've been talking about the last few weeks. It's be salt and light. Tell the truth. Do not resist an evil person. Love your enemies. Give, pray, fast, and so on. The fourth aspect, the Lord provides His people with a choice. In Genesis, it was the tree of life versus the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In Matthew, it comes down to the passage that we read today, particularly verse 24. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. So when we look at the Sermon on the Mount within the context of Jesus introducing a new creation, chapter 6, verses 19 through 24 takes on a greater significance than just a warning against money. You know, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was preparing the sermon, and I wound up talking to my dad about it probably about a week or so ago, is that I often forget, and I think we often forget, that Jesus would have been present in Genesis at the time of the fall. You know, in John chapter 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. So Jesus was there when Adam and Eve decided against God. He was a witness to the fall. And so he would have known that that choice that they made all those years ago literally dictated the entire path of human history and set in motion the eventuality that Jesus would have to come to make things right. So he knows better than anybody how important this message is. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus comes and he does this whole process. And I don't think it's a mistake. I think it's very intentional, because what he's trying to land on is this idea that Jesus is providing another chance for people to make a choice. And he uses the language of money and possessions because he knows the near universal sway that it holds over people, though I don't think that we should read it as being just solely about money. You know, every person has to make a decision as to what treasures they will store up and which paths their lives will take. You know, it's been a banner week, the Pagenkopf household, because I finally, after like 3 years of poking and prodding, I got Sarah to start watching Breaking Bad. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that show, but basically it's the story of a chemistry teacher who has terminal cancer and completely rationally decides to go into the meth business. And so the story basically is about his journey, about him going in and starting to manufacture and distribute crystal meth. And wow, this is a real weird thing to talk about at church. But what's interesting about it is that you watch his journey. And initially, he's making the case that, he's saying, I'm doing this to provide for my family. He's making these justifications, about it's okay that I'm doing this because, they need to be taken care of. And really, I'm only doing it for a short time. And then, and this is my priority. But once I've got enough, I can stop. And what's interesting is, and I'm going to try not to spoil too much of it because Sarah hasn't seen the end of it yet, but what's fascinating about the show as you watch it is that there are numerous times that he has the ability to stop. There are numerous times when he has a way out, where he doesn't have to keep going down the path that he's going. And time after time after time, he makes the wrong choice. And eventually, he has a conversation toward the end of the series, and he's talking to somebody, and he says, he comes to this moment of realization. He says, I used to justify this as taking care of my family. I used to justify this as, that I was doing something good, even though it's this terrible, terrible thing. And he says, but I realized that I've only been doing it because it's what I want, because I liked it, because it made me feel good. It made me feel powerful. And so you see that example, and it becomes such a tragedy when you hear that, because you watch his journey throughout it, and you're hoping at some point he'll wise up, and then you realize when you get toward the end that there was no hope. He had chosen his master long before, and he was committed to that. I'm also reminded of a personal story. Whenever I preach, I typically think about two things prior to my coming up here. The first is I always remember back when I was a kid and when I had to do this my first time. I was in third grade and I gave a 5 to 6 minute speech, and it was terrifying. Worked on it for like 3 to 4 months, and actually speaking in front of people wasn't really the problem. It was speaking in front of my dad. He was a very harsh critic at times. You know, he'd start doing a sentence, he'd be like, "No, I didn't like the way you did that. Start over." You know, and so I always kind of think back to that. You know, I remember just how much work I would put into a 5 to 6 minute speech. You know, and now in a couple of days I preach. You know, and it's weird how my life has changed in that regard. But the second thing I think about, and this one's kind of unusual, and I will qualify this by saying I talked to my wife about this before I came up here to say this, so she's very aware that I was going to bring this up. So don't think she's going to be mad or be throwing anything at me. She might throw something at me, but for totally different reasons. But the second thing I think about whenever I have the opportunity to preach is I actually think about a girl that I used to date. And there were some people like, it's all good. Spoiler alert, we're not together. But when I lived in California, I dated this girl, and it was a pretty serious relationship. And it seemed like it might be heading toward the big M. And, you know, and seemed, like I said, it's great quality. She was a Christian, you know, we seemed to have a lot in common. But there was this point in our relationship where I was talking to her about just kind of where I was at in my spiritual life and my relationship with God. And I remember having this really critical conversation. You don't always think of them as critical at the time, but when you look back, you realize the significance that conversation had. And I remember telling her, I said, I just expressed to her that if God ever called me to ministry, if God ever called me to serve in some capacity that was going to take me away from you know, working in business or whatever I was doing, that essentially I wanted to be open to that. I wanted to prayerfully consider it, and I you know, wanted to allow the possibility for that in my life. And was shocking to find out that this girl I had been dating proceeded to tell me that in no uncertain terms did she have any intention of ever being a minister's wife, an elder's wife, a deacon's wife. No way. Close the book on that. And, you know, you do what you do a lot of times in relationships, and, you know, I heard that, and I was like, ooh, that's not good. But then I just kind of like brushed it away for a while. I was like, I won't deal with that right now. And the relationship ended for a variety of reasons that had nothing to do with that particularly. But as I've thought back in my life, and I've looked back on that relationship, I've come to realize that relationship was doomed from the start. If you take away all the other factors, all the other reasons why we broke up, it didn't change the fact that I was going to be presented with a choice between two alternatives. I could either have the relationship I wanted to have with God, or I could have the relationship with the girl. And there was no scenario in which I was going to be able to have both, because there was no way I was going to choose that. And so whenever I preach, I always think about how grateful I am that my life has gone this direction. And I'm thankful very thankful that I have a wife that told me very early on, she said, hey, if that's ever the call, we're going to go. And I said, okay. And so my encouragement to anyone that is, to any of our young people or to any adults that are single or anything like that, I just have an encouragement to you to choose the people that choose God, because it makes all the difference in every other decision that you will make in your life. But every single person will have to make the decision as to what treasures they will store up and which paths their lives will take. And the choices that we make, as we've talked about, have eternal consequences. And so I have a few questions. Do you choose for the here and the now, or do you choose for what is yet to come? Are we satisfied with the riches that this world might be able to offer, or do we hold fast to the promise of the riches that await when God calls us home? Which master will you serve? The message is yours.